Well, first of all, it's a huge honor to be joined by so many incredible leaders and distinguished minds in energy to talk about actions we can take to help address rising oil and gas prices. I'm Josh Gottheimer, and with Brian Fitzpatrick, we're the co-chairs of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus, the 58 of us. And some members might be coming and going as we sit here, but Brian and I are leading today's conversation. We are joined by several distinguished guests. Obviously, coming in, beaming in live here is Dr. Jurgens, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and respected expert on energy, international politics, the global economy. Karen Harbert, who's the CEO of American Gas Association, the CEO. Heather Zeichel, who's the CEO of Clean Power Association. Amanda Eversole, who is from American Petroleum Institute, Executive Vice President and Chief Advocacy Officer. We really wanted to have a conversation today, Brian and I, about energy. And this is an issue that we've been focused on as a Problem Solvers Caucus now for years, but particularly in the last months, where we've come forth with taking a much more all-of-the-above approach on energy, recognizing not just that we need to deal with the short-term issues of higher oil and gas prices, which are affecting so many Americans, but also how do we, at the same time, think long-term. And we believe you can do both to deal with climate change and all the issues we've addressed there. We think it is a false choice to say that you have to do one or the other. We think you can do both. And that's the approach we've been taking together, especially as Americans are grappling with higher energy prices. We don't believe that we should be relying, and Brian has spoke out pretty strongly on this with Senator Manchin, Senator Collins, and others about early on about Russian oil, and said that we should not be looking at Russia for our dependence on foreign oil. We should be focused on much more energy independence. And we certainly shouldn't be turning to countries like Venezuela or terrorist Iran to look for more resources, even as we focus on the longer-term critical climate goals. So I know that Brian and I have both said, and we've sat down with executives and leaders of not just on the climate front, but also on the oil and gas companies, and say, what can we do to get domestic production up? In the short run, how can we help people get some relief? Last week, the president said that American oil companies aren't drilling more, even though there are reports they have nearly 9,000 permits to drill. I've said pretty clearly that I think the president should be getting the senior people from oil and gas companies together to say to them and figure out together what we can do to get up production. I know that the president just directed the Energy Secretary to convene an emergency meeting with oil companies in the coming days. I think that's a step in the right direction, but really we need to ramp up oil and gas production domestically quickly, get into hyperspeed to replace some of what we're not getting from Russia and deal with increased demand and get prices down for families. So that's really why, from our perspective, while we're here, I'll turn to Brian to add to that. I'm very lucky, by the way, to have such a phenomenal leader and co-chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus.
So yeah, thank you all for being here. We have Dave Joyce from Ohio who came in to join us. He's a member of our caucus, and with all the challenges that our country faces, the one thing that we have, no other nation has, is an entrepreneurial and innovative base of human capital that we can tap into and try to fix these problems. And that's really what we need to do here. The subtext of all the challenges going on globally right now and domestically, but particularly in Ukraine, it's energy. Energy is the subtext of all of this. And when you're not energy independent, it's not just an economic challenge, it's a national security issue. So we appreciate you guys being here.
I think it's okay if we start with just a quick intro from all of you, if that's okay, and then we get into questions. Is that what fits? Dr. Jurgen, do you want to open up?
Sure. Do you want a few introductory comments?
I think really brief who you are, and just really brief, and then we'll get right into questions.
Right. Yeah, I just have about 3 minutes of comments. I realize it's 8 months ago since I met with you last. At that time, inflation was transitory. The energy crisis was outside the country, not in the country. And of course, there was no war in Ukraine. But I think the problem solvers were very focused on looking down the road and saying, what are the energy problems that are coming? I think the difference, there are many differences now, but basically the amnesia about energy security that gripped the country, partly because we became energy independent, is over. The realities are very evident in motorists, very evident in people going into stores to buy food, where 70% of the cost of food is in fact energy. The fundamental fact is we're in a global energy crisis. I hope I'm wrong, but I think it's going to get worse. It may well end up the worst of modern times. And we need to deal with the crisis as it is. Whatever the longer-term aspirations, we need to put some of those, just focus in on this. And we need to be realistic about it. What can be done? We can't just keep living off of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, as helpful as that was. And there's a risk, as you all know, of panicky policies that will make things worse. So, a little calm reflection. The fundamental fact is we need more oil, and that, that with the sanctions going in place on Russia, it's going to become more acute. Iran, there's no nuclear deal with Iran, so no more oil from Iran. If China does come out of COVID and its demand goes up, this market gets tighter, and it's a really very dislocated market. So there are a couple of strange things I want to point out to you. In every crisis, from the Korean War to the 1990-91 Gulf crisis, there was a close dialogue between the government and the energy industry. Not this time. The conversations with other producing countries, obviously we're going to see Saudi Arabia coming up, even Venezuela, but not the domestic industry, and that's strange. I think the lesson of history is that the government needs to have a strong, open dialogue with the domestic industry, as the chairman was saying. Stop rehashing old sound bites about price gouging, which accomplish nothing, And I'll give you an example. Germany has done something quite remarkable. It has reduced its imports of Russian oil from 35% to 12%. How do they do it? The Greens, the environmentalists, sat down with the oil industry and said, how do we make that work? So I think we need that kind of dialogue, and it's just not there. Using these sound bites doesn't accomplish anything. It's also a little weird, actually, to say that the U.S. domestic industry isn't producing oil. There's an organization called the Energy Information Administration, EIA, which is part of the U.S. government, and it says this year, U.S. oil production is going to go up over 800,000 barrels a day. That's more than any other country bringing new production. In fact, it's probably more than all the other new production in the world happening. And next year, EIA says U.S. will be producing 13 million barrels a day, an increase of 3 million barrels a day from where we were at the beginning of 2021. So every time I hear, why are the companies producing? I say, just look at the U.S. government statistics. They're doing more here than anywhere else in the world. And I think the third strange thing I would mention is not talking to Canada. I shouldn't say not talking to Canada. I don't mean Ottawa, I mean Alberta. I mean not talking to Caracas, but Calgary. The Albertans say that if they work with the U.S., they might be able to squeeze up to 400,000 barrels of oil very short order by managing logistics together. And it would be very helpful to forget the arguments right now while we're in a crisis about where you stand on Keystone XL and talk about what could be accomplished with better coordination with existing infrastructure. One other thing I would say, if the sentiment and judgment is that investors are holding back investment, talk to investors. Tell them to ease up the pressure. But the extraordinary fact is U.S. production is going up very dramatically right now. There are supply chain problems that the government might be able to help on. Costs to bring on a new well have gone up maybe 30%. There's shortages of equipment and so forth that are inhibiting things. If you started a well today, that might have taken 6 months. It might now take 12 or 18 months because of supply chain problems. But you're seeing these are very large numbers that are coming on. So I just can't understand it when they say, why aren't you producing? They are. I'm speaking more bluntly than I normally do, but a lot of my work is focused on energy crisis and understanding them. And it's because, at least as I look at it, and just think of what could be down the road 3 or 4 or 5 months from now, because of the urgency of this situation and its risk and not only the risk, the difficulties it creates for motorists, consumers, for businesses, for America. So I think a little realism and going forward in the kind of spirit that's really represented by the problem solvers could be very timely and have a big impact. But you got to put, the rhetoric has to be put aside, it seems to me. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yergin. We're very lucky to be joined by Dusty Johnson from the great state of North Dakota.
Very lucky.
Very lucky. David Joyce joins us. Jim Costa joined us. And Alexander joined us.
And Dan Misher.
Oh, yes, User joined us. Sorry, from Pennsylvania. If we can turn now, when we'll get to questions, I'm sure the members will have some questions as well. We'll turn to Amanda Eversole from American Petroleum Institute to speak next.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity. And Congressman, I'll point out I was born at Valley Hospital in Ridgewood, New Jersey. So
you're obviously got all the energy you need then. Perfect.
That's right. That's right. So I'll sort of cut to the chase. At API, we represent 600 oil and gas companies here in the United States and nearly 11 million men and women in this industry. And we share the ambition of this caucus. We are focused on solving problems, and as Dan Yergin just pointed out, we face very significant problems here together. Just yesterday, we released a 10-point plan focused on real solutions that the administration and that you together can help us enact to drive increased supply here in the United States. And so when we're looking at a time when the world gets even more complicated, I'm a military spouse, and very much focused on our national security and the dedication that our military service members and their families make. We have the opportunity to lock in our energy independence for generations to come, and it starts with good policy. So I look forward to the discussion here today, and thank you for including us.
Thank you so much. Next, Heather Zeichel, sitting to your right, who's CEO of Clean Power Association. Heather?
Right, well, thank you, Congressman, and not only was I Rutgers grad, you and I used to work together, so I feel like that should count for
Look at
something.
that, all this Jersey love, you're gonna make all the members. Sorry, Dusty.
That's fine. I'm used to it, Gottheimer. We all stack the deck.
I am the CEO of the American Clean Power Association, which is a relatively new trade association in Washington, D.C. We represent all clean energy technologies, so wind, solar, storage, and transmission. While we are not quite at the heft of API, we are growing. Today we are 415,000 strong in the workforce, and we power 57 American homes and businesses. From our perspective, there is a really important conversation happening. Not only has this body demonstrated the ability to prove that energy issues can be bipartisan in nature through the bipartisan infrastructure law, we are using and implementing those tools on a very aggressive timeline. I think as we look to the future, my primary message, whether it's to this body, the Senate, or the White House today, it's we've got to do no harm. And a big challenge that we have had is in siting and permitting of offshore wind, challenges around bringing solar panels into the United States. So there are some certain headwinds against this industry at a point in time where we should be trying to do everything we can to bring every single energy source that is affordable, clean, and reliable into the country. So we look forward to being part of the conversation today.
Excellent, thanks so much, Heather. And next is Karen Herbert from the CEO of American Gas Association. Thanks so much, Karen.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. And since you're the problem solvers, I think you're going to find that we are the solutions providers today. So it's great to be with you. And who do we represent? If you get natural gas in your home or your place of business, we represent all those companies that deliver it. So to put that in perspective, 187 million Americans use natural gas in their homes. That's more people than voted in the last election. We looked at the Problem Solvers Caucus, and over 50% of your constituents use gas to heat your homes. And if you add cooking in your house, that adds another 10 to 20%. So you have a big stake in what happens with energy policy, and particularly with natural gas. 5.7 million businesses also use natural gas, and we're growing. We've already added 300,000 new customers to our system this year. We've built 6,000 miles of pipe, which is becoming incredibly difficult to do, and I agree with Heather and others that have talked about permitting reform is something that this Congress and the administration must get busy on in order to continue to meet our energy demands, which are growing, and we're investing. We invest $95 million every day into our system, so we're putting our money where our mouth is to make it safer, more energy efficient, and to reduce emissions. So we agree that it's a false choice to have to choose between addressing climate change and energy security. We believe we can do it both, and we're proving it out every day. And let's not forget that we're also a global solution to energy poverty and energy injustice around the world. Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much.
All right, Dr. Yergin, you ready for a question? You've written about fracking, you've written about Putin, Xi Jinping, how they, the three forces remade energy landscape globally. What do you think the U.S. can do to make sure Americans pay less and our oil dollars aren't going to murderous dictators like Vladimir Putin?
I mean, the question is a little hard to hear, but I think the question was what to do to make sure that dollars aren't going to dictators.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think the best thing to do is support the Europeans now in terms of reducing their dependence on Russian energy, because it is those energy sales that are truly financing Putin's war. And I'd say that's the immediate thing. And that's why, you know, to really do this massive relocation, reassessment, positioning of the global oil industry, you really need governments working with companies very closely. You need what the Germans did with in their own specification, you need it on a global basis, because your markets are highly dislocated. So the best thing to do is work with the people who manage the logistics to make it as smooth as possible in order to reduce the cost and then ultimately reduce the amount of money that's going to the Kremlin. I mean, we calculated they were getting something like $250 to $300 billion a year from sales to Europe. Now, in 2 years from now, Europe will be buying very little energy, I think, from Russia. But the problem is right now. So I think that's the #1 priority, to work with the other countries and to work with the industry to manage this fast dislocation that's occurring in order to reduce the flow of money to Vladimir Putin.
So Dusty Johnson here from South Dakota. I guess a follow-up, you say that we need, and can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, I can't, yes.
Where's the mic? Is that?
It's there, it's the arrow.
So you say that we need to work aggressively to get this done. I mean, tactically, what does that look like? I mean, exactly what should we do? I mean, something like new LNG terminals, I mean, that's a multi-year project. We've already heard about permitting and siting being a problem. So exactly what should we be doing?
Well, I think right now, I mean, it's interesting how fast the Germans are moving. They say they'll have LNG import terminals, some floating ones up by the end of the year, because they have really seen that they just, I was with the German economics minister, and he said it was a terrible mistake to be as dependent on Russia as they were. They're really moving fast. I think it's understanding where the bottlenecks, the flows are, helping to, you know, to facilitate the smooth operation of an industry that's really going through a shock right now. And so that means day-to-day working, you know, as we've done it like in the 1990 crisis, working day by day with the people who, as I say, manage the flows to minimize the bottlenecks and the difficulties. And you know, it's all about logistics right now, is the name of the game. I mean, there are other things that are going to be done. The Europeans are going to face some tough questions this winter if their natural gas supplies are if they don't have sufficient gas in storage. But I think Vladimir Putin, his strategy for winning is basically to keep the economic pressure, to drive inflation, to drive disruption, and particularly in Western Europe, and break the Western comity, the Western alliance that's been created to deal with this aggression. And you know, I think he's very strategic about it, but we have to be strategic too.
If I could ask a follow-up on I mean, it's Amanda and Heather, I'll ask you both this, you can take turns in this one. Do you, if you were in that meeting that the president just called for, and bring all the oil and gas executives together, what would you do? What would you say to them? What would you try to encourage them to do to try to get production up more in the short term? Are there steps we could take to try to get more into the best marketplace? Are there certain guarantees on price that you'd want to either to use the SPRO for, or are there steps that you think we could take in the short run to actually get capacity up? Certain guarantees you'd want to know. And Heather, do you think that'd be smart to try to get capacity up, given longer-term climate goals? So I guess I'll start with you.
So I would start with, there's 10 things that can be done right away, and I'm happy to make this available to folks. But I'd also say, Congressman, that tone matters here. Just a year ago, the White House was, and throughout the campaign, was focused on making sure that fossil fuel industry really went away. And now we're in a different geopolitical circumstance, we're in a different economic circumstance, and unfortunately, our industry is not something, we can't just flip a switch and turn things back on. We are very motivated to increase supply to meet the growing demand that we see. And there are things that we can do in the short term, but it starts with, what about opening up access? At this time in the Obama administration, there were 47 lease sales. In this administration, there's only been one that was invalidated by the courts. And so there's tactically things we can do right away, but we also have to make sure that we're creating an investment climate and where investors are willing to continue to invest in this industry. We think that the future is bright for us, and we are focused on energy transition, and we work together very closely in a lot of different areas. But it can't just be on one day, it's we want you to go away, and the next day we need you to come back. The investment climate doesn't work like that, and our companies plan on decades-long time horizons, and we can't turn on a dime like that.
And just to kind of pull on a thread there from both Dan and Amanda, I think our message to the administration would be, now is the time to double down on an all-of-the-above energy approach. It's something that this country knows how to do. We are well positioned to do, and certainly on the oil and gas front, there are a handful of steps that can be taken between Congress and the administration. I would say the same thing is true on the clean energy portfolio. I mean, we had China that built more wind in 2021 than every other country built in 5 years. Last year, we only built 318 miles of transmission lines, when the average is 1,100. So there are many indicators that we're moving in the wrong direction. And if we are really focused on this all-of-the-above approach, I think that the issue, from my perspective, is it's less about can industry find its way together. I mean, between API and the American Clean Power Association, we share many of the same members, but we've got to turn down the political rhetoric and really get focused on what are the solutions that we can all live with together.
I'll just
could I jump in and add something that ties together what Heather and Amanda and Karen all think? I mean, our permitting system is pretty broken in this country, and the fact that it just takes so long to get anything permitted is really a problem in terms of being responsive. And I think it's just it's so different than it used to be, and I think they would all agree that that's a fundamental thing to try and fix. The other thing, if there is a meeting, I think you referred to, of the administration, the president with the industry, if it just turns into a photo op and an opportunity to harangue rather than to problem solve, which you all are dedicated to, it won't be very constructive. I mean, the focus has to be on problem solving because we have a very big problem.
And I'll just echo what a couple of my colleagues have said, that tone really does matter. When you hear out of the administration that this industry is going out of business in 10 years, that is not motivating for the investor community to open up their coffers to continue to invest. And so I think that really is important. Markets are very efficient, they respond, but they're listening to the tone and tenor of this discussion, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to justify to their stakeholders to make these long-term bets on our industry. So that's the first point. To Dan's point, and we've all brought up permitting, last year was the least amount of permits that were issued in our country's history. So it's real, and this takes time for this infrastructure to be built out. We have the most advanced energy system in the world. We are the envy of the world in terms of our abundant supply and our delivery systems. And we can continue to deliver on clean energy into the future with additional investment and additional permitting. So I think that's an area where the Congress and the administration can work together, because there's permits that are currently sitting at FERC. They could be accelerated in an environmentally responsible way. And that helps wind, it helps solar, it helps gas, it helps oil, it helps everything. And it delivers on the energy promise for our citizens and for those around the world.
Follow up, if I can? Sure. So, I mean, I agree with all of this, but again, I'd like us to try to drill down a little bit more specifically exactly what we do. I mean, we struggled with this before. I think in 2005 EPAC, there was a federal backstop authority for transmission siting. To my understanding, that's never really been used. I mean, when we talk about permitting being broken, what makes it better? I mean, is this a shot clock? This is a limitation on interveners. I mean, what exactly do we do to make this better?
So I can start there. I mean, and I wish that I could tell you that there's one perfect solution, but as I think about the industries that I represent, the needs of the offshore wind industry are very different than the needs of some of my utility companies, right? So it's not, I can't say that there's like one best thing that's going to fix this problem, which is part of the challenge, right? I think it's also part of the reason we don't have solutions, because it requires people to sit in a room, roll up their sleeves, and really figure out, like, how do we do this? If I told you the process that any one company has to go through to get an offshore wind permit, it would make your eyes cross. Like, it is incredibly difficult. There's absolutely no certainty. There's no timeline. There are lawsuits and interventions across the board. And so we currently have tens of billions of dollars tied up in companies that want to build offshore wind, but literally cannot get one agency in the Commerce Department to speak with another agency at the Interior Department. And like, those are, so thinking strategically about shot clocks, thinking strategically about how do we permit and streamline these processes, thinking about, we've never permitted offshore wind in this country before. What is it going to take? You actually need staff and you need resources. And right now, these agencies are under-resourced and not even able to process the pending permits that are in their offices. So it's not, and again, my needs are probably a little bit different than Amanda's, but all of us probably have a little bit of a different take on what's helpful. But getting some certainty and predictability, getting some timelines, getting NEPA guidance that actually allows us to move these projects forward, because candidly, the administration is currently working on NEPA guidance that I don't think is workable if you want to build. It doesn't matter if it's an oil pipeline or a transmission line for clean power. So it's and I appreciate the question, but it's just that there's like a lot of little things and it's complicated. But certainly, like, from our industry's perspective, this is an area we'd love to continue the dialogue.
Can I just jump in and add that the tone matters here too, because the incentives for regulators in some of these cases, particularly if it's controversial, is to not do anything or is to delay. And so if we can help change the conversation to one that's solutions oriented, and the tone is about getting things done in a way that's ensuring the end product is affordable, reliable, and cleaner, then we can get going here. And so again, but if we don't figure out a way to change the incentives in the system, then the incentive is to not act. And that is bad. It's bad for all of us, and it's bad for the American people.
Yes, we have Carol Bordeaux from Georgia and Tom Malinowski from New Jersey. Tom, do you have a question?
Yes. Okay. So, I want to go back to, I think, what seems to be a fundamental dilemma right now, which is that, number one, we desperately need the fossil fuel industry to be producing more right now because our constituents are suffering and angry, and because we want to beat Putin. And his strategy is to hurt us economically so that we stop doing what we're doing. At the same time, and I'm not going to be totally diplomatic about this, most people think that maybe not in 10 years, but certainly in 25 years, the industry does need to go larger. There is a growing political consensus around that, and also just a market consensus. The next generation is moving in a completely different direction. And I understand the crazy, impossible position that puts you guys in. You're hearing these demands from us right now. We need you to produce more. And at the same time, yes, I mean, we envision a future in which we're getting energy in a different way. And so you're talking about the need for new leases. But that's not going to, we all know that that's not going to solve our problem this year or next year, because the new leases are about investment in stuff that's going to produce 5 to 10 years from now. So how do we resolve that dilemma? And you can understand the skepticism of some when we hear that, understandably from the industry's point of view, like, give us more, but the more is about 2025, 2030. The Arctic thing is not until 2031. is there really a strong case for significantly greater investment right now in production that's not going to come online for 5 to 10 years? Is that truly necessary for you guys to use the existing resources that you have in the United States and around the world to meet the current crisis? And help me resolve that dilemma.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and respectfully, I guess I don't take the premise of, the fact that we should be out of business in 25 years. I mean, this industry has been innovating for more than a century.
Well, you may be doing other things. I mean, our great hope is that Chevron and ExxonMobil will become clean energy companies, that you remain the biggest, most successful companies in the world, right? But you're not going to get there by directing all of that new investment into new oil drilling, right? I mean, should that investment be, especially for the large companies that can afford it, shouldn't that new investment be directed towards that transition?
Well, in my view, look at technologies like carbon capture and sequestration. There is a way to bring manufacturing back to this country in a way that helps everybody beyond this industry. And I think, this is where words matter. But signaling to the investment community that fossil fuels should go away, people simplify that to the companies should go away. And that's really, that this conversation is really helpful, because what we're focused on is figuring out how to make our business more efficient, how to make sure that we're bringing that innovation to the table. But if we're not able to get the investment dollars, if we're not able to focus on innovation, right, then we're not able to help bend the curve and change over the long term. And so, this is I take your point about leasing. Of course, that takes does take some time to bring things up online. But if we weren't able to do over the last decade and a half, in terms of investment, in terms of being able to access unconventionals in a way that we haven't before, this country would be in an entirely different place. We wouldn't be debating on, maybe a little more here and a little less here. We would be more reliant on food, and we're not. And so we need, there are ways in which we can move past the rhetoric and get to solutions, and we look forward to working with you on that, sir.
Could I add 3 sentences to that? Just one of the things that we are all focused on is innovation, reimagining, and in my case, the gas utility of the future. And they're doubling down on their investment. We have 200 renewable natural gas projects up and running right now, and that's capturing waste from hog farms, dairy farms, landfills, wastewater treatment plants, cleaning it up and putting it into our systems. So that's a climate solution, but it involves keeping our system alive, our delivery system. And if we don't get the signal that the delivery system is still going to be here 20, 30, 40 years from now, what is the incentive to invest in these new technologies? We're investing in hydrogen. We just put $125 million into the Gas Technology Institute to develop the solution on hydrogen for this country. So we're at the table, we just don't want to be on the menu.
If I could add on that too, I think that if we think about 2050, the U.S. will be using a lot more energy. A lot more of it will come from Heather's sector of the energy industry. But I think that Amanda spoke about carbon capture. When you do the numbers, it looks like oil and gas will still be a significant part of the energy mix. It'll be a more significant part in other parts of the world. What I hear from developing countries around the world is they need to develop oil and gas to get out of poverty, to make sure that people aren't cooking with waste wood anymore and getting the ill effects from health. And I think that in a way we have a luxury that let's say the Chinese don't have, which is that the shale revolution is what led to the amnesia about energy security. If we were still importing 60% of our oil, we'd be a lot more worried about where our oil comes from. And I think that the other thing about domestic production, a lot of it is short cycle, so it's not 5 or 10 years to develop, it's shorter term. So it's a question, who will be producing the oil that the world needs? And I think the U.S. will still be using a fair amount of oil and gas, maybe using it differently with carbon capture and so forth. But, so I think the mindset that you described is it's very important to recognize that mindset is there. But, the reality is what's happening today. And if we didn't have the shale revolution and the capacity to add almost 1 million barrels a day, which is what's happening right now in the United States, it's happening right now, we'd be in a lot worse shape. And so, you're not going to be able to do anything about inflation until you can get a handle on our energy system.
Dave Joyce from Ohio.
Thank you very much. I told Dustin before he left I was going to refer to my distinguished colleague and try to continue on what he brought up about his security issues. I was wondering, I believe it was the gentle lady from API who referenced a 10-point security plan. And if you could expound upon that a little bit about what it's going to take for us as regulators to figure out how we can be of assistance to you in implementing.
Well, thanks for that question. And I mean, I think from our perspective, we are trying to move past the rhetoric of, should we produce more or not produce more? The idea here is, there are 10 steps that we can do now. We can do 2 of them, we can do all 10 of them. Some of the things that you in this room can help us do, others are within the purview of the administration. We've talked about some of them, additional access. We've talked about permitting reform. We're offering reforms to NEPA, putting that shot clock on a 2-year shot clock, we think is critical, because otherwise, again, the regulatory incentives are to slow things down. Certainly accelerate some of the LNG permitting, some of the terminal permitting. We've seen a couple come through, but there's more, and that can make an immediate difference. We are the world's largest producer of LNG now, and we are a significant exporter. That's important for this country. It's important for our friends and allies in Europe right now. We've talked about investment capital and access to capital. Again, the more that we focus on the industry going away, the more that signals to investors to put their money other places. Again, this industry is so vibrant here in the United States, and it's important to signal our time horizons are over decades, not over news cycles, and that's really important to us. We haven't talked a lot yet about supply chain bottlenecks, but that's really important. And lifting the steel tariffs is something that the administration could do right away. Of course, we are big consumers of steel, but it's not just steel. It's issues within sand, water, various things like that. It's finding truck drivers and skilled labor, which is another area on our plan. The workforce is incredibly important, and I focus very much on diversity, equity, and inclusion within our workforce, and we're doing, as an industry, some really exciting things there. And I'll just end by saying, really focusing on the refining sector as well. There was, the President sent a letter to a number of our members this morning, criticizing some of the switching that we've seen over refineries, but again, this is where tone matters. And in this country, it is incredibly difficult to build new refineries. And while we see some of our member companies have switched over to their refineries to biofuels and other renewable products, at the end of the day, we need to ensure we are running at near peak utilization rates. And this industry stands ready to support the security needs of this country. But again, we need to do so in a way that can be predictable over the long term. So I very much appreciate the question. Thank you, sir.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I guess I would just say one of the things that caught my ear was the comment on supply chain. And since this conversation is about what do we do to produce more energy in America today, some of the supply chain disruptions and some of the regulatory decisions by this administration have led to 10 gigawatts of projects getting shelved in 2022. So there, as you are thinking about the oil and gas piece of the puzzle, I would just encourage you to think about, this is truly a group that represents all of the above energy solutions, and I think there are a lot of things that we can do, whether that's offshore wind, battery storage, solar energy or transmission. There are a lot of things that our industry can and do to help position us for the future, because as everybody knows, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And so if we can really focus on what are the things we need to do to have this just transition, I think this is obviously one of the most important bodies in Congress that can help achieve that vision.
And on the supply chain, let me just echo a real example, which is we have in our industry what's called mutual aid. Normally it's invoked if there's a hurricane or some other natural disaster, other utilities come from other parts of the country to help. We now have requests for mutual aid for actual products. So we're moving valves from one part of the country to another to help another utility continue to operate. So that breeds inefficiencies into the system immediately. So the supply chain is real. And we see the administration invoking the Defense Production Act to construct electric heat pumps. And that's just an interesting choice for energy policy, that's where you're going to put the heft of the administration in trying to construct a product to put into people's homes that they're not asking for at this moment. So I think we can rationalize this a little bit, the supply chain and how we're using the strength of the Congress and the administration.
Mr. Costa from California.
Thank you. The point you made about doing something we've always done is expectancy of ourselves. It's a good point for this conversation. I chaired the subcommittee on energy and public lands back in 2008 through 2010 when we had our last energy crisis when it was $110 a barrel. It's 120 now. And in the 18 years I have been on the Natural Resources Committee, we're dealing with the politics and not the policy. And it's the bumper sticker, right? The Republicans will continue to say, drill, baby, drill, and Democrats say, lose it or lose it. And none of them constitute an energy policy, frankly, in my view. And so is this an opportunity to really have the problem solvers maybe come together with other like-minded people from the private as well as the public sector, with the administration to do what would be the equivalent of a Manhattan Project for both short-term and long-term efforts. And notwithstanding my friend and colleague Malinowski, demifying energy companies, I don't think is a solution to the problem, frankly. It's because in 10, 20, 30 years, the major energy companies in America some of them are already making the transition. Frankly, in California, 32% of our energy is renewable. You add hydro to it, it's close to 40%. And yet California produces almost 50% of its fossil fuel. And natural gas is the energy du jour in California because of our non-attainment air bases, both in LA and in the San Joaquin Valley. So there is a strategy, I believe, and right now we're at a juncture where I always believe when you have a cross-section of politics and public policy at this point is when you can get some things done. And that's the frustration you're, I think, explaining to us. So I think, we really need to, I don't know that it's a 10-point process, but we ought to look at the short-term bucket, we ought to look at the long-term bucket. I'm suggesting to our leaders here in the Problem Solvers Caucus on what would be an equivalent of a Manhattan Project to look at, because what I used to say in energy, my friend, Mr. Bishop from Utah, I said, this is mind-numbing doing this as we've done and stuck with our rhetoric, which doesn't offer solutions to both short-term and long-term public policy that will encourage the sort of investments that the private sector needs with signals that doesn't result in finger-pointing or the blame game, which we do here a lot, as we all know. So, I think that we've got to figure out a way to come together, and there's an opportunity.
So before we get to Dan Musser, CBS News, you have a question?
I just wanted to ask the person here, and anyone at the table, if they have, I know some of you touched on it, a specific reaction to the President's letter this morning calling on...
I can't hear, so if you can...
I'll repeat the question. Doctor, I'll repeat the question after. Sorry.
A reaction to the White House's letter this morning calling on oil and gas companies to expand their refinery capacity.
The question was, do we as members have a reaction to the President calling on the refineries to expand refining capacity?
I have a question related to that, if you don't mind. And that is for API. Sort of, my understanding is that we have had 11 refineries that have been closed since COVID. We are actually, capacity is down 1.3 million barrels a day. So one is, does it matter if we increase supply if we have this choke point around our refineries? The next question is, I don't understand, actually, we have those 11 refineries. We don't have to build them de novo. We don't have to, why, and it's been a year or so that we've had this increased demand. How long does it take to reopen refineries? What is it going to take to get that back open and moving again? Yeah, and I'll ask Dan to jump in here too, but some of the regulations around HF Alky have have created great pressure within the refinery sector. And again, the technology within these refineries, it's not all the same factory over and over and over again, right? They're very highly sensitive to the type of crude that they're refining, the type of products that are coming out at the end of the day. And so there are 40 of the 130 plus refineries that still use this HF-alky formulation. And so part of what we're calling for in this plan is to ensure that we have the ability to continue to operate these refineries, because the pressure on closing, they're energy intensive facilities, the pressure on closing them is high. And again, if we further constrain capacity, that has very negative implications generally for the marketplace. But Dan, I'm happy for you to jump in here too.
Well, I think, people didn't close them because they were doing well. They closed them because it was very hard to operate them, and that between regulation and the economics, that they just didn't, perform, and there was a lot of pressure to do that. I think also, if you remember we were reporting like 800,000 barrels a day of Russian oil until some months ago. And we basically had a global refining system. And so Russia was actually a very important part of the refining system. That part of the system is disrupted. And so it's not only crude oil, but it's this refining issue because of this war that has made this more difficult. But, if they took the pressure off and, that some of these might operate, I don't know which ones could start up again. But if you think about it, there's incredible economic incentive to operate a refinery today. So people are not doing it to be kind of malicious. They're doing it because they couldn't make them either competitive, or that the costs of the constant new regulations on it were making it prohibitive to keep it going. So, but that's a very good question, because we have two problems. We have a crude oil problem, and then we have a refined product problem. And the whole world diesel market, for instance, is very tight. And you hear about American trucking firms now saying, they're on the margin because of these. That's why I just want to emphasize this could get worse, and need to approach this in the spirit of the problem solvers, not in the spirit of sound bites. And so far, it's really been approached largely in sound bites and ignoring, no dialogue. I still don't understand why there's not a dialogue with the domestic industry after all these months. Why is it, yes, go to Saudi Arabia and talk to Saudi Arabia, but why not, a reasonable discussion on an ongoing basis, not just a.
I think, by the way, I think to that point.
We're getting to that issue.
Mention one thing to Rebecca.
Yeah.
Rebecca, I think the whole conversation today, I think part of what you heard, and Dan, you can build on this, but is I think if this is if you're going to have an all-above approach, we're going to have to bring every player, every aspect here to the table, right, to make this work. And you have to actually talk, right? You can't just send it, and obviously letters are fine, right, to get more information, to bring more information together so we get some more answers. But I think, and the president asking the secretary to bring people together was a good step. But I think the White House should bring the oil and gas producers into the White House and have a direct conversation with them of what steps that we can do, that the government can help, steps where they can help to get up production. And I think that's what you heard here today, not pointing fingers, but actually bringing everyone together.
Yeah, Mr.
You're right, Josh.
And to that question, you can't just say, hey, increase your capacity. There needs to be a game plan to make it happen. The rhetoric issue, it's not so much the rhetoric, it's the actions that follows the rhetoric. But if you have a complete mindset, and I was glad Jim brought up where Tom Malinowski says, oh, your industry is going to be out of business in 22, or in 20 years. That's just such nonsense. I mean, we heard that in 02. We heard that 20 years ago. Even if, it's easy math, even if the renewables account for 50% worldwide, the capacity needs aren't going to change from where they are now. So we're still going to have at least 50% will be from cleaner, we hope, fossil fuels, but they'll still come from fossil fuels. And you think China and India and Iran and Russia are going to be following such guidelines? And yes, American companies will probably continue to sunset.
we are the problem solvers. It's easy to point out the problems here. And I was really glad to hear this panel outline the problems that kind of affirm many of the things that we all know to be true. And when you talk about a dialogue, there is the dialogue. There's just not a lot of listening to the needs of an industry that can increase and create investment. Keep in mind something. We don't have gas lines where we're running out of gas, not yet, right? Diesel, we're starting to talk about diesel rationing, which is scaring the heck out of a lot of businesses, logistic companies and all. But we haven't run out, right? The price has just gone way up because of the global marketplace that sets the price, and it falls right along at every step along the way has to pay more. So the permitting, if we had an actual game plan by the administration for permits, fast tracking permits, if frankly the dogs were called off the investment banks and the banks, okay, I even mean in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, banks are being warned of what their carbon footprint is and everything. And if you don't think the board pays attention to that, they do. They start backing off. They start looking for other investments. And that affects the price of, because a lot of it's based on the futures market. So it all gets affected there. The shutdowns, the prohibitions on the public lands, whatever, ANWR, the Gulf, right? I mean, those were just basically sanctioned. So there were going to be no movements there. And then, the rhetoric to me is always the last thing. But how about all this false blame? You all, the energy companies, the fossil fuel companies are price gouging. This is actually the highest capacity we've ever had. Wrong. That's wrong by about 1 million barrels. We truly need to listen to the industry, to get some reasonable plans in place, and call it a transition. It's already happening in Texas. 14% of Texas's energy is renewables. Jim just said 30% in California. So it's happening. Those incentives are there. We got to let the marketplace handle it. We can't have this, go green or else mentality. That's what's causing this. So we need the standards. We need investment. We need fast track on permits. We need to encourage LNG exports and just LNG as a whole. We need to open up for the things that you're talking about, Josh, and as you folks are saying, stop the rhetoric because that's to me that's the wake that's left after the actions. Anyway,
any closing comments from you guys? Any closing thoughts?
I think we just appreciate the opportunity to have the dialogue. We certainly would, whether it's coming up with ideas in the near term, ideas that require congressional action versus regulatory, we as an industry stand ready to work with all of you.
And I just say the precision of the problem that we're trying to solve is really important. And so we're both focused on increasing supply and also figuring out how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the atmosphere. And so if we can focus on that rather than saying this industry should be favored over another industry, then we might come up with a different solution set. So we really appreciate this bipartisan conversation. We look forward to working with everyone going forward on these solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen.
And we're all in on energy security and reducing emissions. And one thing that the problem solvers could do is to support LIHEAP. That's the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program. Because we know that high energy prices is regressive. The least that can afford it pay the most when prices go up. So 800 organizations have asked the Congress to fully fund LIHEAP. During the pandemic, when people were most exposed, actually funding for LIHEAP doubled. We're not asking for that, we're asking for full funding. So please take a look at that. But we're all in and we'll be part of this discussion all the time.
Excellent. Dr. Yergin, last word.
Well, I was thinking as I was listening to this once, I talked to one of your former colleagues, Michael Oxley from Sarbanes-Oxley, and he said, the lesson of Sarbanes-Oxley is be very careful about legislation you pass during a crisis. And of course, we have an election coming up in November, and so I think the political pressures to not bring people together, not have the kind of dialogue to solve problems, well, as you all know, will probably grow greater. But I think the spirit of what the Problem Solvers represents is exactly what's needed to address this in a very pragmatic way and look at what is the reality and what are the risks down the road. Is this actually going to get worse? And what happens if that happens? How do we avoid it? And one of the most important currencies in a crisis is information, and information between the government and the industry, and that flow doesn't exist right now. So I think, like all of us, really appreciate the opportunity to come here and just kind of talk about what some of the realities are, as opposed to the sound bites that are out there that don't accomplish anything. So thank you very much for the opportunity, and what a change from when I was there in October. So again, thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists, and I think it's important that when we have these conversations, they don't end here. One of the things we want to do is build a relationship with you all, know that we exist, know that we're the bipartisan group that actually talk to each other, because that's what's needed to fix this. So if we can collectively figure out what requires administrative action, we can advocate. What requires legislative action, we can actually do and accomplish in our chambers. Would be very helpful.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.